Tonight, your challenge is to separate what is true from what is false. Some real, some fake. Can you judge which are fact and which are fiction? To find out, you must enter a world of both truth and deception. A world that is beyond belief.
Texas is vast, beautiful, and full of history. If you're looking for places that truly embody the spirit of Texas, I have some recommendations for you. San Antonio, Austin, Poteet, Dallas, La Vernia. These are just a few places where you can experience Texas in all of its breathtaking glory. And then, there's Kosciusko, Texas. You won't find Kosciusko in your average travel guide. In fact, if you pull up Google Maps, you won't even find the town. There is no Kosciusko Street, no official town marker. The only thing Google recognizes? The Kosciusko Meat Market. This is because, in many ways, Kosciusko is less of a town and more of a lingering ghost, a place that people feel left behind. Only a handful of residents remain, scattered across the countryside, their homes isolated and quiet. Kosciusko's history is unremarkable. Founded as a Polish settlement, it was once a rural trading post for travelers heading to San Antonio. No famous battles, no significant historical events, except for one dark legend. Most horror fans know the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was loosely based on the crimes of Ed Gein, a serial killer from Wisconsin. But there's an urban legend that claims the real inspiration for the film came from right here, in Kosciusko, Texas. Officially, the connection is just a coincidence. But for those who have heard the stories, it's a little too close for comfort. One story, in particular, stands out. Just before the release of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a young man, naked, bloodied, and barely clinging to life, drove his car into a street post in Poth, Texas, a small town near Kosciusko. When the authorities arrived, they found his body covered in deep wounds. His flesh had been stripped from his thighs and buttocks, his wrists dislocated from the joints, and his ankles shattered. He also had no tongue. He was taken to a hospital where doctors discovered disturbing details. He had been held captive for a week, bound so tightly that parts of his body had lost circulation. His body was riddled with infections, rusty metal fragments found in his bloodstream. He had been starved, dehydrated, and repeatedly assaulted. Before he died, the only thing that he managed to write was one word: Kosciusko. Investigators followed the lead. They searched Kosciusko, starting with the only visible establishment, the Kosciusko Meat Market. They found an elderly couple running the store, selling pork rinds and smoking meats. Harmless enough, right? But something was off. A detective struck up a conversation with a little girl behind the counter. She was eating a Polish candy, swinging her legs like any normal child. But when he offered her a pork rind, she shook her head.
Mama says to eat those only if they made of piggy.
And the detective laughed.
But they are made of piggy. That's why they're called pork rinds. No, they're not. I seen Grandpa make them. He gets a shipment of skin every month. While they're screaming and crying and hollering, he takes the skin right off of those and tosses them in the fryer.
The detectives left immediately, bringing their pork rind samples to the lab. And what they found was horrifying. The results came back. Not pork. In fact, not any livestock at all. What followed was an aggressive search and seizure. Law enforcement swarmed Kosciusko, arresting its few remaining residents. They found blood-stained equipment, buried teeth, fragments of human bone, but with no DNA testing available at the time, they couldn't confirm what they feared the most. The case was eventually closed. The people of Kosciusko faded into the countryside, their children sent to new schools where they were relentlessly bullied. And when the Texas Chainsaw Massacre was released, everyone was convinced that someone in Kosciusko had sold the story. Today, Kosciusko is trying to make a comeback. The dance hall has reopened, the meat market is under new management, and visitors insist that there is a rustic charm to the place. And the new owners of the Kosciusko Meat Market, people do say that they are the nicest folks that you'll ever meet. In the early morning hours of September 14th, 1998, a quiet neighborhood in Evansville, Indiana, was rocked by a brutal and seemingly senseless crime. The murder of 23-year-old Danielle Whitmore remains one of the most perplexing and disturbing cases in the town's history. What seems like an open and shut case would unravel into a web of deceit, conflicting testimonies, and a suspect who would vanish into thin air. Danielle Whitmore was a young woman with a promising future. She had recently graduated from the University of South Indiana with a degree in social work and had landed a job in a local nonprofit helping at-risk youth. Her friends described her as kind, determined, and deeply passionate about her work. She lived alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Evansville. Though the area wasn't known for violent crime, break-ins had been reported in the weeks leading up to her death. Some neighbors had claimed that they had seen suspicious figures lurking near the complex, but no one could provide a clear description. On the night of September 13th, Danielle was last seen leaving a friend's apartment at around 10:30 p.m. She drove home in her 1995 Honda Accord, parking just a few feet from her building's entrance. Security footage from a nearby convenience store captured her stopping briefly to buy a bottle of water, as well as a pack of gum at approximately 10:42 p.m. What happens next remains a mystery. The next morning, Danielle's employer grew concerned when she failed to show up for work. Calls to her cell phone went unanswered, and by noon, her best friend, Megan Roots, decided to check on her. Upon arriving at the apartment complex, Megan immediately noticed something was wrong. Danielle's car was still parked in the usual spot, but her apartment door was slightly ajar. Inside, Megan found a scene of horror. Danielle's body was discovered in her bedroom, partially covered by a blanket. She had been stabbed multiple times in what police later described as a rage killing. There were no signs of forced entry, and no valuable items appeared to be missing, ruling out a robbery. Police quickly zeroed in on two suspects. The first was Danielle's ex-boyfriend, Travis Calloway, a 27-year-old mechanic with a history of domestic violence. The two had broken up 3 months prior, and friends claimed that Danielle had been avoiding him. Calloway, however, provided an alibi, claiming he was working a late shift at his job, which was later corroborated by security footage as well as his coworkers. The second suspect was Danielle's upstairs neighbor, William Grayson, a 38-year-old construction worker with a criminal record. He had been convicted of assault in 1994 and had a reputation for being aggressive. Witnesses claimed that he had been seen outside his apartment that night, pacing back and forth. When questioned, Grayson acted nervous and provided conflicting statements about his whereabouts. However, without concrete evidence, police couldn't charge him. A crucial breakthrough came from forensic analysts examining the crime scene more closely. They found an unidentified fingerprint on Danielle's nightstand, as well as a partial DNA sample under her fingernails, signs that she had struggled with her attacker. As the investigation progressed, the authorities sought to question William Grayson again, but when officers arrived at his apartment 3 days after the murder, they discovered that he had fled. His apartment was abandoned, and his landlord stated that he had left in the middle of the night, without notice, carrying only a single duffel bag. A nationwide manhunt was launched, but Grayson seemingly vanished. Police suspected that he had connections in Tennessee and Kentucky, but no solid leads emerged. Over the years, there were sporadic sightings of a man resembling Grayson in truck stops as well as motels across the Midwest, but none had led to his capture. With Grayson gone and no additional suspects, the case grew cold, but questions still lingered. Why wasn't there any forced entry? Did Danielle know her killer as well as willingly let them in? Or had she been stalked and ambushed? And most chillingly, where is William Grayson now? Over the years, amateur sleuths and internet forums have speculated wildly. Some believe that Grayson may have died or assumed a new identity. Others think that the real killer was never caught, and Grayson simply ran because of his record, not because he was guilty. To this day, the murder of Danielle Whitmore remains officially unsolved. If you have any information about the whereabouts of William Grayson or details related to the case, please contact the police department or your local crime tip hotline. In the sweltering summer of 2007, the quiet town of Bakersfield, California became the setting for one of the most bizarre and horrific crimes in modern history. A seemingly ordinary man consumed by obsession, committed to an act so grotesque that it left law enforcement, psychologists, and the public grasping for explanations. What drove him? What was his delusion? Madness? Or something even more sinister? The story of Kevin Langley is a cautionary tale of how obsession, unchecked, confessed her into something monstrous. Kevin Langley was 31 years old, a man most would consider unremarkable. He worked as a customer service representative at an electronics store, living alone in a modest one-bedroom apartment, and had no significant relationships. Co-workers described him as polite but withdrawn, the type of man who blended into the background. But beneath the surface, Langley harbored an all-consuming fixation, one that would ultimately drive him to commit a crime as ritualistic as it was deranged. For nearly a decade, Langley had been obsessed with the 1999 film The Mummy, more specifically, with the film's alluring and treacherous character, Anck-su-namun. What began as an admiration grew into obsession that seeped into every aspect of life. He collected Egyptian artifacts, studied hieroglyphs, and immersed himself in ancient texts. His apartment was filled with replicas of scarabs, scrolls, and 3D-printed seductive statues of Egyptian deities. His co-workers recalled his incessant ramblings about mummification, as well as the afterlife, speaking as if he truly believed in the power of ancient rituals. But his obsession took a dark turn when he became convinced that Anck-su-namun needed to be resurrected, and that he was the one destined to bring her back. Mariam Said, or Mary, was a 27-year-old woman working as a cashier at a local gas station. She was kind, hardworking, and, according to her friends, had a warm smile that made customers feel welcome. She had no idea that a man that she barely noticed had decided that she was the key to fulfilling his twisted fantasy. Langley first encountered Mary in early June of 2007. To him, she bore a striking resemblance to the actress who played Anck-su-namun, and from that moment on, his infatuation became deadly. He began visiting the gas station daily, often purchasing nothing, lingering in the aisles and watching her. He memorized her schedule, noted her routine, and kept a log of her activities. He convinced himself that she was the perfect vessel for Anck-su-namun's return. In his delusional mind, he believed that the ancient Egyptian queen was trapped between realms, waiting for him to free her. By performing a ritual, he was certain that he could transfer Anck-su-namun's spirit into Mary's body, an act that, in his eyes, would make her love him as she had once loved Imhotep. On the night of July 18th, Mary finished her shift and walked to her car. Surveillance footage from the gas station security cameras captured the last moments that she was seen alive. Langley's car was parked nearby, its engine running. As Mary unlocked her car door, he struck, knocking her unconscious with a blunt object before dragging her into the back seat. A co-worker on a cigarette break caught a glimpse of the struggle but, in the dim parking lot, assumed that it was a lover's quarrel and thought nothing of it. But Mary never made it home. Over the next 5 days, Langley kept Mary captive in his apartment. Investigators later described the scene as something out of a nightmare. His one-bedroom home had become transformed into a macabre shrine. Hieroglyphs were scrawled across the walls in black ink, crude translations of ancient prayers to Osiris as well as Anubis. Candles flickered in every corner, casting eerie shadows over the cluttered space. In the center of the room lay his handmade Book of the Dead, handwritten on tea-stained paper, bound together with twine and covered in symbols that he believed would grant him access to the afterlife. Mary was bound and gagged, forced to listen as Langley chanted incantations, read passages from his book, and prepared for the ritual that he was convinced would change everything. The details of her final moments remain unclear. What is known is that Langley attempted to perform a crude form of mummification. Police found evidence that he had tried to replicate the embalming process, using common household chemicals and materials. Jars containing oils, herbs, and even makeshift canopic containers were recovered from the scene. The air was thick with the stench of decay by the time that authorities arrived. Mary did not survive. Whether she had succumbed to her injuries, asphyxiation, or the chemicals that were used remains a point of forensic analysis. Langley remained in his apartment with Mary's body for 3 more days. During this time, he continued his rituals, rearranging symbols, chanting prayers, and fasting in an attempt to purify himself. He believed that he had made a mistake, that something had gone wrong with the ceremony, and he needed to correct it. On July 23rd, after nearly a week in isolation, Langley accepted his failure. He left a note written partially in hieroglyphs and partially in English, which roughly translated to, "The gods rejected me. Anck-su-namun remains lost. I must join her in Duat." Langley was found dead in his bathtub, having taken his own life through a combination of blood loss as well as chemical ingestion. When police entered his apartment, the scene that they uncovered was unlike anything that they had ever encountered. Sandra's mummified remains lay atop an altar, surrounded by candles. His homemade Book of the Dead was open, its pages smeared with ink and what appeared to be blood. The case horrified the nation. Psychologists studied Langley's history, suggesting that he may have suffered from untreated schizophrenia, or a severe delusional disorder. His obsession with the mummy had transformed into something deadly, proving how unchecked mental illness can spiral into violence. Mary was buried by her grieving family, remembered as a bright, loving woman who had her life stolen by one man's madness. As for Langley's Book of the Dead, it was examined by experts before being locked away in an evidence vault. It remains there to this day, a chilling artifact of an obsession that had led to unspeakable horror. In the heart of Kansas City, amid the bleak and desperate years of the Great Depression, one of the most perplexing and brutal murders in American history unfolded within the walls of the President Hotel. The victim, a young man who checked in under the name Roland T. Owen on January 2, 1935. Just 2 days later, he would be found in his hotel room, bound, beaten, and stabbed multiple times. His true identity, Artemis Ogletree. His killer, a mystery that endures to this day. This story begins with deception. When he arrived at the President Hotel, the man who would later be identified as Artemis Ogletree used the alias Roland T. Owen. He brought almost nothing with him, just a comb, a toothbrush, and as well as a hairbrush. He was tall, a young man estimated to be in his early 20s, with a distinctively somber demeanor. The hotel staff noted his peculiar behavior right away. He requested an interior room, one without a window facing the street, and had no visible luggage. An unusual choice for a guest planning an extended stay. His erratic actions deepened the intrigue. The maid, Mary Soptic, recalled that Owen insisted on keeping the room dark at all times, only allowing her inside when necessary. On one occasion, as she cleaned the room, the telephone rang. Owen answered, speaking in a hushed but uneasy tone, addressing someone named Dawn. This name would surface again in the investigation, though no one would ever determine Dawn's true identity or his connection to Owen. Throughout his stay, multiple witnesses reported seeing Owen with another man in his room. The bellboy, who delivered a message to Owen on the evening of January 3rd, was surprised to find that despite a weak voice inviting him to enter, the door was locked from the inside. With no response to his repeated knocks, he left, assuming that the guest was either incapacitated or unwilling to answer. On the morning of January 4th, hotel staff grew increasingly concerned. After receiving no response from within room 1046, they used a master key to enter. And what they found inside was nothing short of a nightmare. Owen was sprawled on the floor, barely clinging to life. His wrists and ankles were tightly bound with a length of cord. His skull was fractured from repeated blows, and his body bore deep stab wounds. Blood covered the walls and the bed and even the bathroom. And despite his horrific injuries, Owen remained conscious for a short time. When questioned about who had done this to him, he gave a baffling answer. "Nobody did this to me." And within hours, he succumbed to his wounds. With no identification, no wallet, and no known family at the time, investigators faced a daunting mystery. The name Roland T. Owen led nowhere, and fingerprint analysis turned up no prior records. The only leads were the cryptic name Dawn and reports of an unknown man seen entering and leaving the room at odd hours. Months passed before the case took an even stranger turn. A woman came forward, identifying the murder victim as her son, Artemis Ogletree, who had left Birmingham, Alabama in 1934 to travel the country. Even more chillingly, she claimed that she had received letters from her son after his supposed death. These letters were typewritten, an unusual detail given that Artemis had never used a typewriter. Who had sent these letters? Were they meant to mislead his family? And if so, why? As investigators scrambled for answers, bizarre theories emerged. Some believed that Ogletree had fallen victim to a violent love triangle. Others suspected that he had run afoul of organized crime, possibly connected to illicit activities during the Prohibition era. Some even suggested a deeper conspiracy involving espionage or secret societies. Yet, despite decades of speculation, the case remains unsolved. And the identity of Dawn, the purpose of the cryptic letters, and the true events leading up to Artemis Ogletree's murder remain an enigma. To this day, Room 1046 of the President Hotel is remembered as the setting of one of America's most haunting mysteries, a tale of secrets, deception, and a brutal crime that justice has never been able to solve. In the dense, shadowed hills of eastern Kentucky, where the land is thick with stories both whispered and forgotten, an eerie and unsettling mystery unfolded in the fall of 2023. James Carter, a well-regarded investigative reporter from Louisville, had always been fascinated by the strange and unexplained. For months, he had been consumed with the folklore surrounding the so-called blue-skinned people of Kentucky, a mysterious group that locals claim still live in isolation in the most remote corners of Appalachia. What began as a deep dive into a peculiar genetic condition known as metemoglobinemia quickly escalated into something far more chilling. The Fugate family, whose blue skin was a hallmark of this rare disorder, had been the subject of Carter's research. But it was the unconfirmed rumors of this modern-day descendants that piqued his interest. These stories spoke of a reclusive family, untouched by the outside world, whose blue skin had become more pronounced through generations of inbreeding. James Carter set out with a singular goal: to uncover the truth behind these shadowy figures, descendants of the original Fugates, who had long since faded into myth. His journey, however, would take him down a path that no one could have predicted, one that would lead to his disappearance and an unsolved case that would haunt the region for years to come. On the morning of September 14, 2023, Carter packed his car with nothing but a camera, a notebook, and his unshakable curiosity. After months of meticulous research, he felt certain that the truth was hidden somewhere deep within the Appalachian wilderness. His first stop was Hazard, Kentucky, a small town nestled in the heart of the mountains. There, he checked into a dilapidated roadside motel, the kind of place where locals came and went without much fanfare. He informed the motel clerk of his plan to visit Casey Cemetery, a long-abandoned burial ground on the outskirts of town. To those familiar with the area, Casey Cemetery was no ordinary resting place. It is located at the end of a winding, desolate road known to locals as Hell's Gate. Hell's Gate earned its name from a litany of strange occurrences: hikers who vanished without a trace, inexplicable flickering lights between the trees, and whispers of disembodied voices carried by the wind. For years, residents had avoided the cemetery, especially after dark. But Carter, with his reporter's skepticism and desire to crack the case, dismissed the warnings, saying that, "I've seen stranger things," he had told the clerk with a confident grin before heading out. The last person to see James Carter alive was the motel clerk, who recalled the reporter leaving in his red sedan, the tires kicking up gravel as he disappeared down the long, winding road that led to Casey Cemetery, and that was the last time that he would see him again. When Carter missed an important article deadline and failed to answer his phone, his editor in Louisville began to grow concerned, and after a few days of silence, a formal search was initiated. Authorities combed the area near Casey Cemetery, sending out search parties to retrace Carter's steps. But they found no trace of him. No car, no footprints, no signs that he had even been there. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. A week passed and the search grew colder. And that was when a breakthrough came through, albeit in the most unsettling way possible. Deep in the woods, a team of volunteers stumbled upon Carter's cell phone. It was lying in the middle of a cracked, desolate road leading up to the cemetery. Its screen shattered and its battery completely drained. Forensics teams were brought in, and they began to carefully extract data from the device. What they uncovered sent a chill down the spine of everyone involved in the case. The phone's final images were disturbing, a series of blurry, disjointed snapshots of trees shot in near total darkness. The last video, timestamped at 3:12 a.m., was a shaky recording of Carter's own breathing, ragged and panicked. The camera flickered briefly to his silhouette, tall and unnaturally twisted, lurking at the edge of the forest. The shape appeared humanoid but misshapen, its features warped in a way that defied natural explanation. In the final moments of the video, Carter's voice, barely a whisper, could be heard, stating, "They're watching me. They don't want me to leave." After that, the phone went silent. No more images and no more recordings. The device simply powered off, its battery drained beyond recovery. But the mystery deepened. Despite the phone being found in the middle of the road, there were no footprints around it, no tire tracks, no signs of a struggle, just the abandoned phone and the shattered screen, as well as an eerie silence that clung to the road like a curse. For all of the clues that seemed to point to something sinister, nothing made sense. The investigation into James Carter's disappearance remains open, though progress is stalled. No remains were ever discovered, no physical evidence to tie him to the place where his phone was found. Some locals claim that they have seen strange lights flickering between the trees around the cemetery, just days after Carter's disappearance. Others believe that the Fugate family, or what remains of them, still live in the hills, hiding from the world. That perhaps Carter's research had uncovered something more than he bargained for, something that the descendants of the Fugates had fought to keep buried for generations. Was James Carter's disappearance the result of a tragic accident, lost in the unforgiving wilderness? Or did he uncover a dark, twisted secret, one that he paid the ultimate price to expose? To this day, no one knows for sure. This case remains unsolved, a grim reminder of the damages lurking in the shadowy hills of eastern Kentucky. And some say, if you listen closely on dark nights near Casey Cemetery, you can still hear the whispers of James Carter, forever lost, forever searching for the truth that should have never been found. The dark rural roads of western Minnesota stretch for miles, flanked by endless fields and scattered farmhouses. It was along these roads that, in the early hours of May 14, 2008, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson disappeared without a trace. What began as an ordinary drive home from a friend's house turned into one of the most baffling missing persons cases in modern history. Brandon, a college student from Marshall, Minnesota, had just finished his first year at Minnesota West Community and Technical College. That night, he attended a small gathering with friends in Canby, about 30 miles from his home. Around midnight, he got into his Chevy Lumina to make the drive back to Marshall. It was a route that he had driven before, mostly straight highways cutting through some vast farmland. But a reason still unknown, something went terribly wrong. At 1:54 a.m., Brandon called his parents. His car had gone off the road and he was stuck in a ditch. Frustrated but unhurt, he asked them to come pick him up. He told them that he was near the town of Lind, a small rural community about 10 miles from their home. His father, Brian Swanson, immediately got in his truck to find him, while his mother, Annette, stayed on the phone with Brandon. As his parents drove to where he claimed to be, they saw no signs of his car. They called him back for nearly an hour, and Brandon remained on the phone, guiding them as he tried to describe his surroundings. He could see lights in the distance, possibly from Lind, and decided to walk towards them while staying on the phone with his father. The conversation was calm, and Brandon walked along a dirt road, occasionally muttering about how frustrating the situation was, but never sounded panicked. And then, at 2:30 a.m., everything changed. Brian Swanson, still on the other end of the call, heard his son suddenly exclaim, "Oh shit," and then silence. The line remained open, but there was no response. Brian called out for his son repeatedly, his voice growing desperate, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no wind, and no static. Just an empty, open line. Eventually, the call disconnected and Brandon was never heard from again. At dawn, Brandon's parents reported him missing. A search was launched near Lind, the area that he had described on the phone. But there was a problem. His car was not there. It was found 25 miles away, near Taunton, Minnesota, far from where he claimed to be. His car was in a ditch, but there was no damage and no signs of struggle. It appeared as though Brandon had simply stepped out and walked away. Tracking dogs were brought in, and they traced his scent to a nearby river, the Yellowstone Medicine River. The dogs followed the scent to the edge of the water and then seemingly lost the trail. Some investigators theorized that Brandon had fallen in and drowned, but extensive searches of the river turned up nothing. No clothing, no body, no evidence that he had even been near the water at all. Theories swirl. Had Brandon gotten lost and wandered deep into the farmland, succumbing to the elements? Had he fallen down an abandoned well, one of the many scattered throughout the area? Or had he encountered something that night? Someone who didn't want him to be found. But the most chilling question remained unanswered. What made him say, "Oh shit"? His words suggested surprise, possibly fear, something that had happened in that moment. But with no body, no evidence, and no further calls, investigators had nothing to go on. It was as if Brandon had vanished into the night, erased from existence. To this day, Brandon Swanson's disappearance remains one of the most perplexing unsolved cases in America. No physical evidence has ever been found. His phone was never recovered. His parents, who have since been vocal advocates for missing persons cases, continue to search for answers. But the case remains a mystery. Did Brandon misjudge the distance to the lights and succumb to exhaustion in the vast farmland? Did he stumble into the river and his body was simply never recovered? Or did something more sinister happen that night in the desolate roads of Minnesota? We may never know, but one thing is certain. Somewhere in the darkness of that early morning, something happened to Brandon Swanson. And whatever it is, it left behind only silence.